So we start today as a church family a new series entitled The Happiness Project. If you ask American adults, are you happy? By and large, the largest group of responses that you get is that yes, we are somewhat happy. So we're not ecstatic, we're not very happy, but most of us would say we're somewhat happy. The other thing that we, as the typical American adults, say is we'd like to be more happy. So however much happiness we have, we wish we had more of it. However, those who study this particular issue, researchers and psychologists and whatnot, would tell you this is a notoriously difficult thing to measure because people are biased and they're dishonest. Because we want to seem more happy to the people around us than perhaps we actually are. Or we feel like we have to measure up to the happiness of the people around us, and it may not be the truth of what's going on the inside. Here are a few things I can tell you this morning, though, about your happiness. If you're a woman here this morning, you're more happy than the men in the room. And fairly significantly so. I told my wife this week, and I said maybe it's because the men have women in their lives that they're not so happy. You know exactly what happened when I said that. She threw something at me is what happened. Here's another one that's really interesting. If other people think you're handsome or beautiful or attractive, you are more happy than other people. Now, it's not how you think of yourself, it's how other people view you. That explains so much to me and why I've been so unhappy most of my life. Oh, come on, that was funny. If you walk into any bookstore, Barnes & Noble, if you browse on Amazon, you're going to find that the happiness section of the self-help part of the bookstore is overflowing with titles. Americans as a whole are pretty obsessed with the subject of personal happiness. George Will, the noted columnist, writes about a recent trip of his to the bookstore. To visit a bookstore is to feel misgivings about universal human literacy, which has produced a mass market for hundreds of profoundly sad handbooks on achieving happiness. Having spent the better part of the last couple of months reading some of those books, I'd have to say he's right. But given that there is so much out there on the subject of happiness, I wanted to come at this from the perspective of what the Bible has to say about the subject. You can go and get what pop psychology says anywhere on this. Let's talk about what the Bible has to say about happiness. And let's see, and here's why I picked the title that I did for the series. Let's see if at the end of this series, 5 weeks from now, you and I, if we choose to put into practice the insight that we cover, won't be a little more happy, both short-term and long-term in our lives. In your Bible, you don't often find the word happy. Do you know that? And that's because both ancient Hebrew and ancient Greek, there are different words for what we in English call happiness. More often than not in your Bible, the two words you're going to find that are the English equivalent of happy are joy and blessed. And if you're familiar with the Bible at all, you might know that there are certain parts of your Bible that talk about those two subjects more than maybe other parts, and that's where we're going to focus our attention in this series. Today, here's where I'd like to start. This is for my pal Brian Kampstra, because that guy on the bottom is one of his favorite authors. This is the great Russian Christian novelist Dostoevsky. And he said that the greatest happiness you and I can have is to know where our own unhappiness comes from. So we're going to start a series on happiness today, talking about unhappiness, and seeing if we can find out from the Bible's perspective where ours tends to come from. And in order to do that, we need to go to one particular place in the Bible that probably talks about unhappiness more aptly and concisely than anywhere else you could go. It's the book of Ecclesiastes. If you've never discovered the little book of Ecclesiastes in your Old Testament, you oughta. I would happily tell you that it is one of my 4 or 5 favorite books in the whole Bible. Israel's greatest king in the Old Testament was a guy named Solomon. Greatest because he was the richest, Israel was the most powerful during his reign, etc. And yet, during his life, though he was so wise, he made terrible choices. And at the end of his life, he was full of regret. And most would tell you, or traditionally it is ascribed, that Ecclesiastes is written as wise old Solomon, full of regrets, nears his end. And he passes on to us what wisdom he can. So this is about a 3,000-year-old book. And we want to ask Ecclesiastes, so if we need to start by figuring out where the source of our unhappiness is, where might that be? I'm going to show you 3 places this morning that early on in Ecclesiastes, Solomon tells us oftentimes lead to our unhappiness. Here's the first one. Pretty much the whole first half of Ecclesiastes 2 is about this subject. He opens chapter 2 by saying, I, Israel's great king, said to myself, come now, I am going to make a test of pleasure. Enjoy yourself. But again, I found that this was just vanity or emptiness. Who wouldn't want to make a test of pleasure? I'd like to take that test. I bet you I wouldn't fail that test like I did so many others. He then goes on between verse 1 and verse 11, which I'll read in a moment, to list out all the things he did to test himself and to see whether or not pleasure could fill him. He built gardens and temples. He had thousands of people working for him to accomplish these architectural masterpieces. He became filthy rich with gold and silver. He said he even drank wine to fill his heart with gladness. Who hasn't done that on occasion? And then in verse 11, after recounting all the things he'd done to fill himself with pleasure, he says, and then I considered all that my hands had done and the hard work that I'd invested in doing it. And again, I found that all was emptiness and chasing after the wind. And there was nothing to be gained under the sun. One of the common sources of human unhappiness, your unhappiness and my unhappiness, is what you might call a good thing. And yes, there really can be too much of a good thing for you and me. There's nothing wrong with pleasure. There is nothing wrong with hard work. There is nothing wrong with money. There is nothing wrong with the success that hard work brings you, unless you ask too much of it. And that's what Solomon discovered. In your mind, in your actual brain, every time you do something that you enjoy or you find fulfilling, there is a chemical response. There is a mixture of chemicals in your brain that fire or that fill your neurons every time you enjoy something. Every human being in the room has this response. So it could be pick the thing in your life you enjoy the most. If it were me, one of the things I enjoy the most is hanging out with my kids and just laughing with my kids and being the biggest idiot in the world. And they just think it's hilarious when Dad is that way. I love it. And in my mind is filling to the brim with dopamine and these other chemicals in my head. But you know what? Every time I do that, there's a diminishing return. Every time I do it, I feel that experience, that high, a little less, and then a little less, and then a little less, and then a little less. And if I do it too much or we do it too often and there's no moderation in it, eventually I don't find nearly as much joy in it, believe it or not, as what I did the first time. This is why addiction works the way that it does, by the way. It's wired the same way into your brain. An addict feels awesome when they do whatever it is they're addicted to. Shopping, drinking, smoking, drugs, pornography. It lights your brain on fire with these drugs. And then the 25th time you do it, you don't feel nearly as good. It is the law of diminishing returns. And everything in your life that you like, everything in your life you think you do well works the same way. So says Solomon. What are the things, if I could give you everything in your life that you wanted, a better job that pays better, a bigger house, a car that's reliable, a hobby that you love, whatever it happens to be. Maybe you want it to be deer season year-round. Great, just give me your list. What's on your list of things that you think if you had them in your life, you'd be happy? And what Solomon is telling you is you wouldn't be. There is no amount of pleasure or success or positive results that in the end is not going to leave you feeling like he, Israel's greatest king, did at the end of his life. This is emptiness. There's really nothing to it. I look back at my own life and I see that to be true. I earned the most money that I ever have in my life in my 30s because I worked for a church in New Mexico full of people who had a lot of money. And I look back on it and think, I don't think I was any happier there. Actually, I tell you, I was not as happy there as I am now, 10 years later. My money had nothing to do with it, even though I had a lot more available to me. What about you? Do you see the wisdom of what Solomon says? It cannot be about what you enjoy. Your happiness cannot hang on that. Filling your life with enough stuff that you move from happy thing to happy thing, enjoyable thing to enjoyable thing, it's a losing battle in the end. And frankly, everyone around you gets hurt when you do that. Because if, like for me, one of the things that makes you most happiest is my family, when I'm not happy, I blame them. Man, if I just had a wife who did X, if my kids would just do Y, then I'd be happy. No. It's vanity and chasing after the wind. Can you see it? One of the sources of your unhappiness are the things in your life you enjoy the most, or the things you're best at. Because you think that if you do them enough, or long enough, or hard enough, and you get enough success, that finally you will be happy. And Solomon says, here's the deal. You're not going to be. No matter how much you like it, no matter how good you are at it. This is my favorite of the three we're going to talk about this morning. In the middle of Ecclesiastes chapter 1, wise, regretful King Solomon writes this. I said to myself, I have acquired great wisdom, surpassing all who were over Jerusalem before me. And my mind has had the great experience of wisdom and knowledge. And I applied my mind to know wisdom and to know both madness and folly. And in the end, I perceived that this also was just chasing after the wind. I used to have this next line. I'll tell you the story after I read it. For in much wisdom is much vexation, and those who increase their knowledge only increase their sorrow. So when I was working on my PhD, in the library at Dallas Seminary, all the PhD students got their own little study cubicle, so you didn't have to fight with the riffraff master's students for a table to study at. And one of the verses I had hanging in my cubicle was Ecclesiastes 1:18. For in much wisdom is much vexation, and those who increase their knowledge increase their sorrow. Toward the end of his little book, Ecclesiastes, Solomon writes this along the same lines. This too was hanging in my PhD cubicle when I was studying. Ecclesiastes 12:12 says, of the making of many books there is no end, and much study wearies the body. What do you think he's driving at here? This is part of why I love this book, because he's going to turn what you hear elsewhere in the Bible on its head and force you to think about it in a new way. Let's all agree that wisdom is a good thing. In fact, another book that the same guy wrote would extol the virtue of wisdom over and over and over again. It's better to be wise than not. That's the book of Proverbs. Well, what is Solomon driving at here? That with increased knowledge and wisdom actually comes increased vexation and sorrow. And that one of the chief places from which our unhappiness comes is what he's describing right here. What's he driving at? Let me suggest to you it's a couple of things. As Solomon found out in his own life, you cannot learn enough to stop being a fool sometimes. You cannot grow enough, you cannot learn enough spiritually to outdistance your own penchant for making mistakes, sometimes big ones. And his life bore this out. The wisest man the Old Testament had ever seen lived out his last days full of sorrow and regret because he'd wasted all the money that he had. His sons would, soon after his death, split Israel into two. There would be a civil war from which Israel would not recover, and it would result in two nations, not one. He was a bad dad. He was a bad husband to literally thousands of women, and he regretted. This is what it was like for Solomon. No matter how much wisdom Solomon had accumulated in his lifetime, he couldn't run away from his ability to make mistakes, and sometimes very, very large ones. The same is true for you and me. I hope you don't think that you can grow enough as a Christian person, or that you will learn enough as a Christian person, or mature enough as a Christian person, that you can eradicate from yourself the ability to mess up. Because to mess up is human. And that's why we of all faiths believe that God is a God of compassion and grace. Because the best of us are no different than Solomon himself. I know people here who are deeply unhappy with themselves or other people in their lives simply because they haven't learned that no matter how much they're growing, no matter how different they are today than they were 5 years ago, and it may be remarkably different, they are never going to outrun their ability to make mistakes. Ever. No one here will, including me. Your unhappiness sometimes comes from that fact. Now, the other piece of it is we tend to think that the answer lies around the corner. What I mean is, we think that most of what's wrong or dissatisfying about our lives, what we don't like about ourselves, we think if we could only learn the right thing, that then that would go away. Right? You ever been guilty of that? I would fully confess to you that I spent most of my 20s and 30s reading voraciously at the rate of 2 or 3 books a week. Not just because I was an insatiable learner, which I am, but because I felt like if I found the right book, then it would answer this question that I have. If I found the right book, then it would take away some of the mystery of what it means to live in faith in a God that I cannot see and cannot touch. That if I read just enough, it would make things more concrete for me and I would have to trust a little bit less. And I got news for you. I could keep reading and keep reading and keep reading for 7 lifetimes, and I am never going to get to that point, and neither are you. Most of the answers that you and I need in our life are not around the corner. You already have them. For most of us, the problem in our life is not increasing our knowledge. It's doing better at applying what we already know. Frankly, it's easier for me if I think, well, the reason I'm making mistakes here, or the reason that I'm messing up in this part of my life, is that I just don't know enough. In a very real way, when I say that about myself, I'm letting myself off the hook. No. You want to be a better husband? You feel like you're falling short towards your wife in being a better husband? A marriage book might help you, but you already know enough to be a better husband. Let me try. Want me to prove that to you? You know the golden rule, don't you? Treat other people the way you would have them treat you. You could live the rest of your life trying to live that out in every relationship you have, and you would be amazed at how different and superior your life was after a year or two of just trying to live that one idea out. Want to change your marriage? Try living by that first. The best marriage counselor in the world can't help you if you are not committed to treating your spouse that way. You follow me? Most of what you know to be happy, you already have. I've told you several times before, why don't you work on living out the little bit you know, and then we'll worry about expanding what you know down the road. Because if you're under the myth that it's just around the corner, that if you gain the new little nugget of knowledge, then everything's going to change for you, I'm sorry, it just doesn't work that way. Your growth is very much incumbent upon you deciding to live out what you already have, not what's next. And this is the vexation and sorrow that comes with wisdom, Solomon says. For many of us in the room, I certainly would count myself in this number, this is a chief source of my unhappiness in life. And I stand the chance of being happy, according to Dostoevsky, if I can identify that. Do you find yourself here too? Here's the last one. This is a conversation that wise, regretful King Solomon starts in Ecclesiastes chapter 2. And he writes, "The wise have eyes in their head, but fools walk in darkness. And yet, I perceived that the same fate befalls all of them. And I said to myself, what happens to the fool also will happen to the wise." He continues that conversation with a very famous passage, probably the most famous passage from the book of Ecclesiastes, where he expands on what he means by the same thing befalls all of us, regardless of how wise or foolish we may be. And it is these opening verses from Ecclesiastes chapter 3, in which Solomon writes, "There is a time for everything and a season for every activity under the heavens. There is a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot. There is a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather them, a time to embrace and a time to not embrace, a time to search and a time to give up, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to be silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, and a time for war and a time for peace." You want to know another thing in your life and my life that causes us to be unhappy so often, according to Solomon? It is simply this: you and I expecting our life to be the exception to the rule. And what rule do I speak of? That it's you and me thinking that we can avoid the harder seasons of life that happen to everybody. And almost all of them are outside of your control. It's that list I just read from Ecclesiastes 3. Would you confess with me that many of us live our lives sometimes holding our breath from day to day, week to week, hoping that we never have to go through a harder season of life? And when one of those times of burning down or weeping or warfare comes to pass, we think something's gone wrong. What did I do to enter this season of my life, we think? And it makes us deeply unhappy. We think we are the cause of all our sorrow, all our anxiety. We think we're the cause of the hard seasons. But the truth is, the seasons of your life are no different than summer, fall, spring, and winter. They just come and go. And you don't have very much say about it at all. And neither do I. And Solomon said, I perceive that it doesn't matter if it's the smartest person in the room or the dumbest. The same thing happens to all of them. There are good seasons and there are hard. There are seasons of harvest and there are seasons when the fields are barren. And it just happens to us all. I cannot count for you the number of times that I have met with you and people like you over coffee. And the message that the person is saying to me is, I hate this season of my life. My kids have left and I'm lonely. I'm an empty nester and I hate it. If I weren't 52, I'd want to have another baby. Who hasn't been there? Who won't be there? I just got fired for terrible reasons, completely inappropriate and unjustified reasons. I hate it. I so wish I weren't here right now. I don't like where I live. I don't like my coworkers. I think I got a terrible job. It pays the bills, but I don't like it. And on it goes. But how many of those seasons of your life did you pick? None of them. Now what are you going to do? Are you and I really going to be so naive that we think we can live in summer our entire life? A lot of people do. And a chief source of your unhappiness and mine is that we don't accept the hard seasons when they come. I'm not saying you have to like it. I'm saying your happiness better not be dependent on the season of life you're in. Otherwise, you're in for a rocky, rocky road. And you could spend years of your life not being happy because it's based on your circumstances. It has to come from someplace else. Do you see that? What season of life are you in right now? Is it laughter or is it mourning? Is it love or is it not? Are you watching things in your life build up or are you watching them be torn down and eroded? Odds are you can't change a lot of that. And I hope your happiness is not dependent on it. Otherwise, you could be unhappy for a long, long time. There's a quote I found online that I had no success tracking down the author, but it's everywhere. So at this point, it's become a cliche, and I can't tell you the point of origin. However, it gets at exactly what Solomon is driving at in Ecclesiastes in those three examples. Happy people, as we'll talk about in the weeks to come, focus on what they have. Unhappy people focus on what they think is missing. Every one of the examples in Ecclesiastes that we talked about today fits into that quote. You're unhappy because you don't think you have a job that pays well enough. You can't have all the toys and the trips that some of your friends do. You're focused on what's missing. You're focused on getting one or two more steps ahead in your career so that you'll have greater success. You're focused on what's missing, not where you are right now. You're focused on what you need to learn next so that you can finally be a better person or a better dad or a better mom. And you're focused on what's missing. You so can't wait for this season of your life to be over and transition to the next, and guess what? Same thing. You are focused on what's missing. It seems as if the guarantee for you and I to be unhappy is to always be focused on what we think we don't have, on what we think is missing. Maybe today, here at the end of the message, what you'll do is spend a little time and allow God to speak to you about your unhappiness and its sources in your life. And that will allow us then, over the rest of the weeks of this series, to build a kind of happiness that is not contingent on how much you have or how people treat you or what season of life you're in. Would you pause? Talk to God about your unhappiness. Allow him to speak to you about it and where it comes from. And then after a moment or two of quiet, I'll pray for us all.